Hoi, hello and welcome to the Meet Maastricht Podcast. I'm Katrina and together with our resident local Lucy, we will be exploring some of the amazing stories that make Maastricht so special. So sit back, relax and join us as we learn about our favourite Dutch city. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of the Meet Maastricht Podcast. Today is the 3rd of April. I can't believe it's the 3rd of April. Today we are talking about, Lucy?
The Capuchins Court, or in Dutch, Capucijnenhof.
Yes, so we were just having a chat about the word. So in English, I think when I translated it in very trusty Google, it was Capuchin Court. But you said, Lucy, that Hof has sort of different court connotations and green connotations and different things.
Yeah, I suppose the sense of the word court in English is not quite the connotations that the Dutch word hof evokes for Dutch speakers. What is similar is that both words can be used for a royal court or a ducal court, or so a court in that sense. But my sense of the English connotations is that it basically applies to built up areas, to stone buildings, and the Dutch word hof also means garden or orchard or green spaces.
Yeah, so like a courtyard.
A courtyard, yes, that would be the English equivalent. Yes, and the Capuchins Court is a collection of buildings with a courtyard that used to be very green because of a couple of humongous chestnut trees. Wow. I think they've cut a couple of them down.
And so where is this building that we're talking about?
Close to the market and the Vreedhof. Bear with me for a moment as I try to give a sense of the beginnings.
Yes.
Maastricht got its first city wall in the first half of the 13th century, and that enclosed pretty much the built-up area of the then city. And of course, the city becoming so much more secure and safe because of that wall attracted even more people who wanted to live there in relative security. So within about a century, the authorities decided to build a second city wall, and that enclosed a much, much larger area. Also with enough open spaces to have orchards and farms and places where you could produce food during times of sieges.
Right.
And especially in the northern parts of Maastricht, between the 13th century wall and the later wall, there were large empty spaces. And they have been for quite some time, until pretty much the 19th century, when the industries, the large factories settled there, and the workers came to live all around that. So, but before that time, it was a pretty mixed settlement of small producers, working people, but also convents. And one of those convents was of the Capuchins. Now, the interesting thing is that this actual Capuchins convent was not in the same site that the contemporary Capuchins Court is. So that's I didn't realize this myself either, but it's really silly.
So they had moved at some point?
No, they haven't. The Capuchins.
No?
This is quartz of history all the time. The Capuchin order, as all monastic and religious orders, was abolished in 1795 because of the French Revolution.
Right.
Remember, I mentioned this in the first podcast as well. Maastricht was full of monasteries and convents and religious orders of all kinds and sizes. But in 1795, all of them were abolished, and all the churches were closed, and the convents were repurposed or left to decay. and many of the monastics were chased out of the city. And so the Capuchins had to leave their convent in 1795. And then in the 19th century, starting from very humble beginnings, a new religious order started really only with one man, took in hand the education of the pauper boys of Maastricht, the poor children. And those were the beginnings of an ever-expanding monastic order of educators, the famous Broeders of the Bijaard, Brothers of the Bijaard, who did not live at the Bijaard until the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. They built their great monastery on the Brussels street. But before that, the ever-expanding order and all its functions and classrooms and everything they needed for all the functions they were fulfilling was housed in this collection of private houses and new buildings they made and church they built in what is today the Capuchins Court. So the Capuchins Court was never occupied by Capuchins. It was always occupied by the Brothers of the Immaculate Conception of Mary.
Ooh. So do we know how it got its name then?
Fluke. I don't know.
Just liked the sound of it.
I don't know. I haven't found a reason for this except for the dry comment for the wrongly, I'm citing now the wrongly named Capuchins Court. Okay, why, Jacques? Of course, from the situation of the buildings is clear already. The contemporary site, Capuchins Court, is not where the Capuchin convent was. That was next door, where the synagogue.
Okay. Maybe that's why.
Yeah, that's really.
Maybe it was.
That's really only.
It's next door, but it's almost close enough.
Yeah,
it's
close
fine.
enough. Now that convent was at the site where today is the synagogue on the Bogart Street.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
Bogaerdenstraat, and next to the synagogue is a chapel, which was the chapel of the Capuchin convent.
Okay. So the Capuchin Court as it is now, that was built in the 18th century?
Most of the buildings that are there now were built in the 19th century. So it was more open area, or it was older built up area. But in about the century that the Brothers of the Bijaard settled there and expanded all the services they rendered for the city, primarily the education of boys. Everything was reordered, and structures were built and torn down and changed, and for 100 years everything has been moving around there for a lot, and so it is not an ancient place. It is not a pristinely preserved monument from a particular period. But when it was finally restored in, I think, the 1990s, they have taken great care to leave as much of the original buildings that they could. So when you walk into the courtyard now, which you are allowed to do during the day, you can still see the chapel the brothers built. You can still see some of the buildings that were there already before the brothers. It is a residential area now.
Yeah. It's apartments, I think.
The chapel has been split up into private apartments, yes, and the surrounding buildings have been made into accommodation for people to live in. And some of the older buildings were torn down, and there the contemporary buildings have been built, and also in a clearly contemporary style as well. And that is often the case in Maastricht.
Well, it's adding another layer to the strata, isn't it? Like if you see a cliff face or one of those tubes that they put into the earth and they pull it up.
Yes, exactly.
And they can see all the layers. It's sort of like adding another layer to the history, which is, I think, a nice way to think about it.
Good comparison, Katrina. Yes.
Thank you. So with the Capuchins Court, you said they were teachers predominantly.
That's how it started. There was this young man of a wealthy brewers family, of which there were multiple in Maastricht, and his name was Louis Rutte. So of the Rutten family.
Mm-hmm.
This is officially his name was Ludovicus Hubertus Rutten, and he was born in 1809 and he died in 1891. And he was a bit of a party person in his early years, to the despair of his father. But at a certain point, he discovered his calling, so to speak, to take care of the poor children of the city in a very particular sense. He wanted to educate them in the message of Christ. So he wanted to be a missionary, right, so to speak, for the poor children of his own city. And his father was disgusted. He wanted to occupy himself with these filthy children. Of course, totally ignoring the reasons for the fact that these children were filthy. And his son just did pretty much as he pleased, and eventually the father came round. But for quite some time he had to sort of work around his father. And he was the start of Catholic education for boys in the city. In the 19th century, there was some form of public education for at least boys. I'm not sure about girls.
Yeah.
But of course, quite a few of the Catholic establishment in the city were not really pleased with the fact that the only education on offer was public, and they wanted a Catholic variety as well. So there were rich people supporting Louis Rutte in his endeavor to educate the poor children. And and over the decades, in a slightly haphazard manner, different kinds of education were set up for different age groups, but for decades, especially for the poor children of the city. And later on, they also added a school where the pupils would pay. That school has become the St. Aloysius School, which is still housed at the Brussels Street, right next to the Bayard.
Oh, wow. So that was that began in the Capuchins Court and then has moved to the school.
Yeah.
Wow.
It started in a very small way. This educating the children. There were only two young men educating kids, but in no time at all, there were hundreds of children whose parents thought that at least it was a good idea to park their children with the brothers. And these brothers worked as missionaries as well. So they left Maastricht and went all over the world to found schools and teach, but also to found seminaries and train people to become brothers as well.
Yeah, that was sort of the seminary situation was something I was curious about with the education and the brothers, and was there also a sort of a push for some of the students to go into that monastic life?
I suppose there would have been. I mean, of course, these were the years still of the large Catholic families and quite a few of the clergy pushing families to have as many children as biologically possible. No regard for what that meant for the lives of women, of course. But but of course, people have always had their own brains and hearts and convictions. Of course, there has always been a pushback against this sort of missionary activity as well. But of course, for many families, especially in poor areas, having their sons join a monastic order or a religious order would have been a great relief. if there is not enough work, or if there is not enough land to assure a decent living for all the children, it is of course terrific if one of them becomes a teacher or a nurse, or and all those professions were in the monastic orders.
Yeah, I imagine a sense of pride as well, of especially from a poor family, to say that that you have
definitely, and
someone in your family who is working with such honourable sort of positions.
Yeah, true, of course. And of course the missionaries were held in even higher regard, and of course it was also terrific to have one of your children become a priest.
Oh gosh.
That of course would have been the pinnacle of pride.
Yeah.
But of course what has also happened is that lots of people have been sort of forced into a life of obedience and personal poverty and of abstinence that might not have suited them at all, and they might not have chosen under different circumstances.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah.
At the same time, what of course has also happened, and I suppose this applies especially to the poorer sections of society, and it definitely applies to the women. There were great careers to be had. You could be educated at all levels, going up to the highest, if you were talented enough and if you were pious enough. And so the church offered all sorts of venues for learning and adventure that otherwise would have been closed off to people, and especially women.
So when did the Capuchin Court stop being a sort of centre of education then?
When the brothers had finally built their new convent of the Bayard, the humongous convent in the large park behind the houses at the Brussels Street.
Yeah.
This was at the end of the 19th century. I think they moved into the big new building in the early 20th. And then the buildings of the Capuchin Court were used for a while by a congregation of sisters. Yeah, the female order of the Franciscans. And the people in Maastricht know them as the Grey Sisters. So their habits would be grey, and this is also a 19th century order, just like the brothers of the Bayard. But this order was founded in the late 19th century, and they were specifically aiming at being missionaries. But at that time they considered their European environments as missionary areas.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there were plenty of places, small places and rural places, that needed enlightening just as much as islands in the Pacific or wild places.
Yeah, and it's the what these sisters provided in terms of services to the city was also education. And for girls, and what they were specifically aiming at was to educate and train girls to be good housewives. So they founded a type of education. Here it's called housekeeping school. I suppose in America in America they called it home economics.
Yes, that's what it was called in Australia for a long time too.
Yeah.
I in school, I know, because my mum calls it home economic, but it's called different things for my generation.
Yeah, but of course girls were taught all sorts of, very, very practical capabilities that you'd wish everybody would be told about at some stage in their lives, just for the sake of self-preservation. Of course, it shouldn't be an exclusively female domain. But how to run a household is it does take some skill, and I guess most of us lack that now and have to ask our mothers or just fumble through as best as we can, sort of thing. What I do know is that there was at the time definitely a class connotation also to going into the household school. Girls who were considered smarter at a certain stage, I think in the interbellum between the two world wars. I'm not exactly sure when this education started. They could go to a type of secondary education provided by a different nuns order, the Ursulines.
Yes.
And that was general education. The household school even got its own sort of derogatory name. They used to call it here the Spinach Academy, and that was not complimentary. And it's stupid, but that's the way it went.
The Spinach Academy? Do people not like spinach?
Yeah, the Spinach Academy. I don't know. I have no idea. It's just, stupid stuff. Anyway, what the sisters also did with this, with these lowly, capacities of staying in the house and being a good housewife was also they had a workshop where they and a pretty large group of girls and young women would do all the embroidery of many of the church linens and religious clothing and the banners. And if you go into a church today, even have a look at what is actually on the altars and have a look at what the priests are wearing. All of that stuff is made by hand, and with the most excruciatingly difficult techniques of decorations with just a needle and thread, and it is just breathtaking the beauty they knew how to produce. Anyway, what these sisters also did, apart from educating working class girls to be needle wizards, they would also provide housing and food to unmarried women. So it was the convent was a boarding house as well. So after these decades of boys romping around there with their male teachers, for a few decades, the present-day Capuchins Court has been the domain exclusively of women and girls, which I think makes for a nice contrast.
Yeah.
And then the third chapter in the history started about in the late 1960s, early 70s, when the buildings were becoming pretty run down and they had been left empty for some time. And then one of the large organizations occupying itself with social services in the city wanted to provide space there for the young people, for the teenagers, and specifically the people who were in secondary education. So not the teenagers who were already in paid employment, that was the working youth.
Okay.
But these spaces were to be used by school youth. And the supervision to some extent was done by Jesuit priests, no longer in long flowing robes. They would wear jeans and woolen sweaters. Yeah. And I've spent a better part of my school years there, outside of school, because there'd be all sorts of activities being provided there. Right. And of course, with a very, 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 very slight missionary aspect to it as well. We would have large celebrations of Easter and Christmas, but we would be the ones, the teenagers, writing the texts and reading them out and choosing the music, and so we wouldn't be singing the Gregorian chants. Let's put it that way.
So, what years was that happening?
This is the sisters left in '68. Okay. And then this the organization called Combi moved in at about that time.
Yeah.
And they have been using it for about 2 decades. And the 1970s it was for the school kids, and the 1980s the focus shifted to disadvantaged groups of all kinds. So it was not so much a weekend thing anymore, but it was providing services all during the week for disadvantaged groups in society, with a focus on the young people. Yeah. So drug addicts and people who had to, who didn't come there primarily for partying as we did.
No.
My brother was a bartender, and and they also had their own carnival foundation with a prince and a council of 11, and of course there was lots of dancing every weekend, and concerts, and neighbors complaining all the time about the noise and that sort of stuff. I don't have any photos of me during that time there, although I have been a disc jockey there during those years. So maybe somebody's got
call out for photos of Lucy.
Call out for photos, yeah. They won't remember me, but maybe they'll remember. My signature song was "Play That Funky Music, White Boy." And then everybody knew it was my set, and they'd flood the floor. Yeah. It was fun.
I can imagine.
But that was of course what that place was for during those years. Yeah. It was for fun. And we did have some good times there, of course.
And so after that period I imagine it got bought for the residential purposes that it's serving now.
Yes. Yeah, and in the nick of time, because by this time, the early 90s, it had really become decrepit and slummy, really.
Right.
So of course the city would have preferred to keep it labeled as a place for something social, something public.
Yeah.
But the 90s are of course also the time of just let the market solve it. So lots of stuff was sold in that time to be used by private parties.
Yes.
In instances like these, as I mentioned earlier, I think it is quite a good thing that these deserted and decrepit areas of the city were reinvigorated and have been restored and have been added to and are now in use by people. I think that's good.
Yeah. No, I think and it does look like a beautiful place to live, and it's a great spot in the middle of the city, so I'm sure people appreciate being able to live there.
Yeah, but of course it's only for the wealthy.
Yes. Is there anything else you wanted to add about the Capuchin Court?
No, I think this is a pretty much the overview of let me count quickly, the 5 chapters. The convent, and then the brothers moving in next door, pretty much, and then the sisters taking over, and then the teenagers partying, and now it being a quiet residential area.
Yeah, it's amazing, the progression. I think my final image of the Capuchin Court will just be you playing Play That Funky Music, White Boy. That's my takeaway. Ask a Local segment. Today we have a very special guest. We have Flora with us, who is the third member of the Meet Maastricht team. Do you want to really quickly introduce yourself, Flora?
Sure. So I'm Flora. I'm really happy to be part of this second podcast. I come from France, as you can hear with my accent probably. Yes. And it's been now a year that I'm living in Maastricht. I'm also a heritage and culture passionate. So I'm really happy to be part of the team and to join this podcast today.
Woo! Our first guest. It's very exciting. So our first question was from a follower on Instagram, and it was, what are some good places for children in Maastricht? And we thought, given the current climate, that we would provide some outdoor or some things that you can do hopefully in the future or now, and also some things you can do at home or online. So I know you found some, Lucy. Did you want to give us your children's suggestions?
Okay, the suggestions for outside, they are not specifically for children, but I think they would be manageable with children, but I think adults might enjoy this as well. You know, we're all going stir crazy, of course, being inside all this time. The first one would be to go around the old streets in the city center and look for gable stones. Now, this is something that inhabitants of old European cities would be familiar with, but a lot of other people might be completely new to this. It requires looking up. You know, we tend to go about our business generally just looking straight ahead, or maybe looking into the window displays of the shops. But, you know, very often what is above is much more interesting. Gable stones are the old version of a street name and a house number. This is how people would locate places in the city. So it would be a stone above the main entrance of the house generally, and it would have a picture, and sometimes it would have a name added to that as well. So in the front of the house, on the street side, there would be stones over the main entrance with a picture, with a phrase, sometimes in Dutch, sometimes in Latin, sometimes with the year that the house was built or renovated. So they can be dated, and it's fun, I think. You know.
Yes.
I think to drift around the old streets and look for the gable stones and see how many you can collect.
Yeah, there are so many in Maastricht. It's really impressive, and it was not until Napoleon arrived that there were names in the streets as well of the city. So it was a way to locate yourself really intense. We have to imagine if the city didn't add now street names, it would be something different for sure.
I think it would be interesting seeing someone from a few hundred years ago trying to navigate now, because a lot of them have been moved. A lot of them have been taken from wherever they were originally and put in a wall somewhere, which is obviously wonderful to save them, and if that's the way we have to save them, but they would be very lost trying to find their houses.
There is a particular wall at the little square on the remains of the Roman bathhouse, op de Therme. And there, in one wall, there is 3 gable stones that would just throw a pre-Napoleonic inhabitant of the city. You know, what is this? Okay, that was number 1. Number 2 is slightly less historic, but okay, you know, I thought it might still be fun, and you could make this into a contest also. So go out into the city by yourself or with several people, but then each by yourself or in a team, you know, however you want to organize this, and try and collect as many pictures of statues as you can. You know, and then also have some fun figuring out what they are and what they mean. And so that's there's quite a bit of stuff around everywhere, and you could it would give some direction to your to your walk in the city.
Yeah, and street art as well, like paintings on walls and murals and things would be cool to document in photos.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I wouldn't think of that because it is very contemporary, but yes, you are right.
And you had some digital ones as well, yes?
Well, I had one. There's one I'm thinking about that might be one we will provide in the coming weeks. I'm thinking about making going into the city myself and making a series of pictures, and then asking our audience where these spots are.
Ooh.
Yeah. And I'm going to make it as difficult as I can.
Oh no. Well, I'm sure we'll look forward to that. Flora, did you have some suggestions?
Yes, of course. Well, of course, when they do reopen, I think it's fun, depending on the subject, for everyone to visit the numerous museum we have here in Maastricht. But for the meantime, as we are all a bit stuck inside, or at least in small groups, yeah, it's always fun to enjoy a bicycle ride on the Groene Loper, for example, or around Maastricht, cooking together, doing some activities outside. We are lucky enough that it's sunny, just respecting social distancing and everyone's safety. But yeah, it's always a nice time to do quality things with children, and when everything reopens, there's also Centre Céramique who offers activities with children, so it's a good thing to keep updated on what they offer.
Yeah. Well, one of my suggestions for the future, as we hope we won't be stuck inside forever, would be the Natural History Museum for children. Is really cool for children. They have bees in there, like live bees. They have lots of interactive elements. It's mostly in Dutch, but you can sort of work out what's going on. And for right now, I was thinking the Aldenhof. Is that how you say it, Lucy? Aldenhofpark?
Aldenhof.
Aldenhof. Is a great place to wander, because if you have kids who like the Three Musketeers, you can start up at D'Artagnan. Is that... Flora can help me with my French, and you can help me with my Dutch. Just get torn apart on the podcast. D'Artagnan. But there's also a great, some beautiful wooden sculptures and stone sculptures along the Yeka, along the water. And if you follow the little path along the river, you also get to an aviary where you can see lots of little finches and nice little birds. So that was something that I thought would be really cool for children. And just off of what Flora said, with cooking with kids, I think I have just brought to mind this little cookbook I have. It's a tiny little pamphlet of recipes from World War II and cooking with rations and trying to make imitation things when you have limited supplies. And I thought, if you want to take an opportunity to teach kids about other times when people really had to think about what they were doing, and really, you could definitely try and make some mock apricots with carrots, or some. I think that would be really fun and a good way to educate as well as just enjoy yourself. So those were my suggestions.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yes.
I'll put some pictures or something. I'll try and find some recipes because there are some interesting ones.
I can imagine. And this is definitely historical as well.
Yes.
My insights, suggestions are definitely heritage material as well, but not in the strict sense, I'm afraid. One is a young father reading an English classic to his daughter of about 10. And I think these books date back to the 30s. You might know them, Katrina. I suppose they're known about the entire Anglo-Saxon world. I read them in Dutch when I was a child. The Famous Five by Enid Blyton.
Yeah, I never read the famous. Yes, Enid Blyton. I never read those ones. I did read some of the Magic Faraway Tree, which were also Enid Blyton. But I know they're really famous.
Okay, but it's now the book, which is probably called The Famous Five on Kirin Island again, is now put on SoundCloud by this father reading it to his child.
Yeah.
So I suppose you can find that by just Googling The Famous Five on Kirin Island.
Yeah, we'll try and put a link in the description. Yes.
That's good. And the other one, and I'm really getting off the serious track here, is Hogwarts. Why not join Harry and his crowd at www.thewizardingworld.com, where they are also providing all sorts of fun and games for the secluded.
Yeah, there is so much stuff at the moment for young kids and for big kids like us to enjoy online, which is lovely. Yes.
I have the bonus one is sort of the overarching clearinghouse for all of this material, and that is Google helping to keep us sane at Google Arts and Culture. And there they have material, and it'll be all sorts of stuff, podcasts and video tours and everything and anything from over 2,000 leading museums and archives. So, you can go all around the world and visit all these places you've never been to and may never get to, and still have a look. So thank you, Google, for that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's plenty of. We did provide a link, I think, on Facebook for different museums that were that had virtual tours. But you can also not inside museums, but if you want to have some fun, you could also go on Google Maps and pick a city and have a wander and learn that way. I know that's a fun pastime. There's always some strange things, like someone getting caught doing something a bit weird. So that's fun as well. But there's lots of things to keep kids occupied now and for a long, long time in the future. So thank you for joining us, and special thanks to Flora for coming on to our podcast today.
No, thank you for having me. I was quite happy to share my questions with you.
And Lucy, what are we doing next week? Next podcast?
For the next podcast, we're going to deal with the Bayard, because in the second one on the Capuchins Court, we already mentioned the Bayard several times, and the Bayard is also one of those places that is not accessible to the public. Full stop. So we're going to visit the Bayard.
Exciting! So tune in next time to hear all about the Bayard. Thanks for listening, and stay healthy and sane. Thank you so much for joining us today, and don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook by searching Meet Maastricht, and on Instagram at @meet_Maastricht. If you would like to learn more about us, you can also visit our website at meetmaastricht.eu, where you can buy tickets and subscribe to our monthly newsletter so you're always up to date. Thanks again, and tune in next time to learn more about our beautiful city.
Tot ziens.